We're at the end of a series called Biblical Womanhood. We're going to begin Biblical Manhood coming this next week. We're dealing with the kinds of questions. What is a man? What is a woman? These are huge questions in our culture with huge implications. And today we're going to be in Luke chapter 7. So if you brought a Bible, go with me to Luke chapter 7. If you've got an electronic app on your phone or pad or whatever you have, you might want to go to Luke chapter 7. 2 weeks ago, John led us in a study of the basis for the value and the beauty, the dignity of women, and that has been found in the fact that men and women both are created in the image of God. That is what gives both men and women alike our value. Last week, John entered into, he walked where angels fear to tread and dealt with the subject of submission. And basically what he said is, we're all called to submit to various authorities in various spheres of life. And he talked about submission in marriage. And today we're going to look at Jesus and women. And I think it helps to understand that the time in which Jesus lived, the culture that he lived in, was much like the culture in much of the world today. For example, in many parts of the world today, sons are more highly valued than daughters, so ultrasound is used to determine the gender of an unborn child so that females can be aborted at birth. Kenneth Bailey, who was recently died and was an authority on the Middle East, tells us there are many countries where male children, when they are born, men gather around the father and just basically say, "Mashallah, bless God, you did it." And if a girl is born, women gather around the mother and say, "You poor thing, better luck next time." In some countries, men have a right to beat their wife with the full support of the state and the Quran. In many countries, rape victims, the women, are accused of adultery. They are imprisoned, beaten, and in some countries they're killed. These are the women who've been raped. Much like the first century, the time of Jesus. Did you know in the ancient Greco-Roman world, Greece-Roman world, there was a huge shortage of women. There were 140 men for every 100 women. That was good because soldiers were needed. And what happened was babies were left to die if they were the wrong gender, the wrong sex. Here's a portion of a letter from the first century. A husband writing to his pregnant wife, quote, "If you are delivered of a child before I get home, if it is a boy, keep it. If it is a girl, discard it." So females were disposable. In the first century, this is the world of Jesus, women were just a notch above animals. A woman was considered property, first of her father, then of her husband. A woman's opinion did not matter. Truth is, a woman had very little hope of survival unless she were somehow attached to a man. Roman law placed a woman under the absolute control of her husband, who had ownership of her and all of her possessions. He could divorce her if she went out in public without a veil. A husband had the power of life and death over his wife and over her children. Women were not allowed to speak in public. Enter Jesus into that world. For example, in John chapter 4, Jesus deliberately went out of his way to go into an area where he found a woman, a Samaritan woman, walked up to her and broke every cultural norm to speak to a woman in public, a Samaritan woman, and even ask her for a cup of water, what was absolutely taboo to do in that particular culture. And it shocked her. In fact, it shocked his disciples when they came and saw him talking to a woman in public. John 4:27 says this, "Just then his disciples returned, and they were surprised to find him talking to a woman." Why? Well, you just didn't do that. The rabbis said, quote, "He who talks with a woman in public brings evil on himself." Another rabbi said, "One is not so much to even greet a woman." You see, if a woman spoke to a man in public, she could be accused of being involved with him sexually or of illicit relationship. That could be grounds for divorce. And yet Jesus initiates this conversation with her in public, a Samaritan woman, and he has the longest conversation he ever has that's recorded in the Bible with a woman, and it's a theological conversation about worship with a woman. That must have just stunned her, the Messiah, talking with her about theology in public. Stunned the disciples. No wonder she couldn't stop talking about this man. In Israel, a woman was not allowed to eat in the same room with men. She could not be taught scripture with men. She could not enter into the part of the temple grounds where men were. Synagogue worship was segregated. Women were not even allowed to be heard. The one ancient rabbinic saying was this: it's better for the Torah. These are the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It's better for the Torah to be burned than to be taught to a woman. Women were not allowed to be to testify in court. In fact, this is what it was said, and just put this in your memory for a moment. The testimony of 100 men, of 100 women, the testimony of 100 women is not equal to the testimony of one man. They had no inheritance rights. Here's an ancient prayer in Israel. This is not in the Bible, but this was a common cultural thing. Blessed art thou, O God, who did not make me a Gentile, a dog, or a woman. Now, you're not going to believe this, but there was a group of Pharisees who were called the bruised and bleeding Pharisees. Because whenever they thought they were going to be near women, they would put their heads down or close their eyes. And so they were always bumping into stuff. If they thought a woman was going to be in their peripheral vision, because they thought if they saw a woman, she would tempt them to have impure thoughts. And even if they thought a woman was going to be in their peripheral vision, they would close their eyes and walk around. So they were bumping into buildings, and they were called the bruised and bleeding Pharisees. This was the culture of Jesus' time. This was the world into which Jesus was born. You cannot find a single place in the scriptures where Jesus disrespected, put down, humiliated, or treated a woman with anything less than respect because she was a woman. He went out of his way to speak to women. He allowed women to touch him. He traveled with women. 2 women, Mary and Martha, were among his best friends. He broke cultural rules everywhere he traveled. Not biblical rules, cultural rules. Instead of limiting his teaching in places where only men could hear him, he taught in open places where women and men could hear him. He used illustrations that women could understand, like lost coins or yeast in bread or someone knocking at your door at midnight. He welcomed women as his disciples. He used women to teach some of his greatest spiritual lessons. And I challenge you to find anyone in all of history who treated women like Jesus did. And what I want to do today is I want to look at several women who met Jesus, to whom he spoke under different circumstances. And here's my prayer. My prayer is that women in this room who are a part of Orchard, who are visiting, that you get a new, fresh sense of how Jesus values you as women, loves you, and what he wants to do in your life, and that men get a fresh sense of how Jesus wants you as men to treat women and view women, and that all of us get a sense of how we can trust the Bible. So let's launch right into it. We're going to look at 3 stories very quickly. Luke chapter 7, here's the first one, verse 11. Luke 7, verse 11. Soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. And as he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and he said to her, "Do not weep." And then he came up and touched the bier, or the coffin, the casket, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." And this report about him spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding countryside. So it's a funeral. They're on their way to the graveyard, and a woman is burying her son, and it's the worst day of her life. You know, when I started ministry, I was just a very young pastor, I was not prepared for the pain that parents go through when they lose a child. In fact, one of the first funerals I ever did was for a young couple that their baby died of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. And he was less than a year old. And they woke up one morning and their baby was dead. And there was this tiny little casket, and it was horrible. And I'm on my way to visit this little couple, and I'm thinking to myself, parents never should outlive their children. What in the world am I going to say to this young couple? This is awful. It was the worst day of their life, standing there in front of this little casket. That's this mom. She's wrecked. She is wrecked. And some of you know what it's like to be wrecked. Some of my family know what it's like to be wrecked. I know what it's like to have my life wrecked. And this is not the first funeral she's ever had. Who else has she had die on her? Her husband. Her husband. And this is not just a son. This is her own, look at it. It's her only son, it says. And in that day, there's no Social Security. The son is supposed to take care of his mom. This is why when Jesus on the cross looks down and says, "John, would you take care of my mom?" "Mom, this is your son." He's taking care of his mother. That's what an older son does. This is the only son. She's from this little bitty town called Nain. You can hardly find it on any biblical map. It's just a little hole in the road, nowhere town. Everybody's poor. She doesn't have a hope of any survival at all. So worst day of her life is wrecked. And what we're going to see is Jesus comfort a broken woman. A woman whose life is just wrecked. He sees her, and it says he has compassion on her. I love that. It doesn't say she saw him. He sees her. He goes to her. He's not indifferent. God is not immune to brokenhearted people. God's heart is touched by brokenhearted people. Verse 14 says he touches the casket, which you just didn't do because it made you ceremonially unclean. He touches it and it stops. Everybody stops. You just didn't do that. He touches it. The religious people don't do that. The bearer stood still. What is he doing? You don't touch the undead. And Jesus literally reaches into death, touches that young man, gives him a command. Young man, I say to you, one word, rise. And the young man sits up. I mean, can you picture this in your mind? He sits up. Can you imagine the shock? And he starts speaking. He's rubbing his eyes. And Jesus helps him down and takes him to his mom. Can you imagine you see that mom's look? How long did she hold on to that boy? The tears of joy, the tears of shock flowing. And Jesus stands there and he smiles. He is comforting a broken-hearted woman because his heart is so tender. The emotion of that moment. That's what Jesus does. That's what happened to you if you're a Christian. Because the Bible teaches that until He touches us, we are spiritually dead. I mean, we're physically alive, but we are spiritually dead. And he has to touch us and bring us to life inside our hearts, our spiritual souls. He has to spiritually speak, rise, come to life, waken. It happened to me when I was just becoming a teenager. And by faith, we come to life. If you're a Christian, you were dead in your sins. And he spoke to you and you came to life. And there will come a day, if you are a Christian, there will come a day, if Christ does not return when you're alive, there will come the day when the voice of Christ will speak, rise! And out of the grave you will come. Atoms will come together from all parts of the world, and you will rise and you will speak. So this is kind of a preview. It's a commercial of what will happen in the future. And until then, his heart is not indifferent to hurting women, to hurting men. Some of you have had your lives wrecked. Maybe you're here like that. And I just want you to know you have a God whose own son's life was wrecked on a cross. He cares, he understands, and he speaks to you. And maybe you are here and God brought you here to hear that. One other thing about this, she had people around her. The whole town was around her, weeping with her, caring for her. And it's a horrible thing to go through a wrecking experience, the worst day of your life, and be alone. That's why you need people in your life. That's why you need people who will be there with you. That's why you need a community. You need friends. You need Christian friends. You need a group of people. That's why we keep stressing community groups here. You need a church family. So Jesus comforts a brokenhearted woman. Let's look at a second illustration. This is in Luke chapter 7, verse 36, where Jesus forgives a bad woman. Verse 36, one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and took his place at the table. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her hair and wiped them with the hair of her head, with her tears, and wiped them with the hair of her head, and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment or the perfume. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. And Jesus answering him, so Jesus must have read his thoughts. Jesus answering said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he answered, say it, teacher. A certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. And when they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which of them will love him more? And Simon answered, the one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. And he said to him, you've judged rightly. And then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, so get this picture in your mind. He's looking at the woman, but he's talking to Simon. Do you see this woman? I mean, that's the question. Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss of greeting, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. Then those who were at the table with him began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. So this man invites Jesus over for a meal. Women are not invited to this kind of a meal, not in that culture. And she's called a sinful woman. So maybe she's sleeping with her boyfriend. Maybe she's cheating in her marriage. Maybe she's just known a lot of men. Maybe some of you women can identify with this woman. That's in your past. And she hears Jesus is at this guy's house, and she's going to do the unthinkable in that culture. She gets an alabaster flask of perfume, very expensive perfume, walks to the Pharisee's house, and you got to know she's nervous. She's real. This is awkward. She doesn't want to make eye contact. She walks into a room full of men, and it goes quiet. These are holy men. These are devout men. These are religious men. Everybody knows her reputation. And they smell the scent of perfume that she has used to entice men, perhaps. They see her coming. She notices Jesus' feet are dirty because in that culture, you walk around in sandals and dust, and there's somebody that's got a basin of water, and you kind of wash your feet, or some servant will wash your feet. She sees his feet are dirty, and she does the unthinkable. She approaches Jesus. The Bible doesn't forbid this, but remember that their culture forbids a woman like her to touch a man like him. And she gets down, maybe on her knees, and she touches Jesus' feet. And in that moment, she is overcome with a conscious awareness of how dirty she is. This is what happens when you get close to Jesus. This is what happens when you get close to someone who is genuinely righteous. You become aware of how dirty you are. And if you're ever in a situation where God comes very close, you're only aware of one thing, and that is how impure, how sinful you are. And she becomes aware of how sinful she is, and she begins to cry. Martin Luther called tears heart water. She is publicly acknowledging, I am a sinful woman, and I have deep regret for the life I have lived. Her nose is clogged up. It's just not flowing. Makeup's running down her face, getting all over her dress. And she is wetting Jesus' feet with her tears. She's broken. She is humble. She is grieving her sin. You ever shed a tear for your sin? You ever just been broken because of the life you've lived, stuff you've done? Hey, you've hurt people. Hey, you've hurt God. She may never have shed a tear up until this moment. I don't think she anticipated this would happen. She didn't have a towel. So she lets her hair down. And in that culture, this is not in the Bible, but in that culture, for a woman to let her hair down in the presence of anybody but her husband was the equivalent of taking her shirt off in public. The most shameful thing you could do. Very expensive perfume that she wipes his feet with her hair, wipes the tears off, takes this perfume that's so expensive you wouldn't anoint feet with it, it's too expensive. She pours this perfume out on his feet, and then she just begins to kiss his feet. What is she doing? She's worshiping him. One of the Greek words for worship is proskuneo, which means to kiss toward, to fall down before. She is worshiping him. She is so broken, and somehow she realizes he is worthy of worship. She is worshiping him. And he's letting her do it. And here's this guy who has invited Jesus in, and he's sitting there watching this. And he is thinking there are two kinds of people in the world. There are holy people and there are unholy people. And I'm a holy person and she is unholy. And apparently Jesus is unholy too for letting her do this. And Jesus looks at him and he says, you know what? You're right. There are two kinds of people in the world. There are holy people and there are unholy people. And I'm holy and everybody else is unholy. You're right. Jesus is holy and everybody else is unholy. Look at her. Look at her. She doesn't need another lecture on sin. She understands that really well. She is broken right now. You're the one that needs a lecture on sin. I came in, you didn't wash my feet. You don't honor me. You didn't give me a kiss of greeting. She can't stop kissing my feet. She's given me the most expensive thing. She has humbled herself, ashamed, broken in front of me. She's doing everything she can to humble herself before me. She is broken over her sin. You're not. What's wrong with this picture? Then he tells that little story. The reason she's doing this is she knows what she is like. You don't. And so often in the church, we're like this. We're real tolerant with religious people. We're harsh with broken, sinful people. Self-righteous people tend to just be judgmental of those who are broken and sinful. And so Jesus says to her, he doesn't excuse her sin, doesn't justify her, doesn't say, well, she's had a hard life, I understand. No, he says, you've sinned greatly. You're forgiven. You're starting a new life. Go find a new community of faith. You're forgiven. You love much because you have forgiven. You've been forgiven much. And friends, this is a really good test of faith. Some of us in this room say, I know I'm forgiven. I go to church. I'm a Christian. But the reality is there's no passion in our love for Jesus because we don't realize how much we have been forgiven. How much God had to do to forgive us. We've never seen our sin like Jesus sees it because we've never drawn that close to Jesus. But once you've ever done that, your love for him is passionate. You are unrestrained, even if it makes other people just a little bit uncomfortable. And the reason she is so passionate is she knows she has been forgiven much. That's why she loves much. That's the second story. Third story real quickly. Look at chapter 8, verse 1. Soon afterwards, he went on through the cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 who were with him, these are the men, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, named Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. Now, in the Bible, 7 is the number of completion or perfection. So apparently this woman was full of demons, demon-possessed to the nth degree, we might say. Jesus had rescued her, delivered her. And Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's household manager. So she's a society woman. She's an influential woman. She's highly placed in that culture. And Susanna, we don't know anything about her apart from this, and many other women who provided for them, that is the disciples and Jesus, out of their means. So you've got a lot of different kind of women who are following Jesus along with the disciples, some who have had a really rough past, some who haven't, some poor, some wealthy, and Jesus is being funded by, the ministry is being funded by these women. And Jesus is not only followed by, he's being financially supported by women, which was unheard of in that day. And he receives it. He's not ashamed of it. He's not ashamed of the fact that men and women, as disciples of Jesus, brothers and sisters, are following him together as equals. Unheard of in that day. Breaking cultural rules right and left. So Jesus comforts a brokenhearted woman, and Jesus forgives and is worshiped by a bad woman whose life is totally changed. And then Jesus has many different women following him, as is the case with many women at the orchard today. And I thought maybe the best way to end a series on biblical womanhood is hear from 3 Christ-following women, and the women that I know best, Christian women I know best, are the 3 women in my family. So I'm going to ask my wife and my 2 daughters if they would join me on stage. And we're just going to have a conversation about what it means for them as women to follow Jesus. And Sarah, you're my firstborn, so you have followed Jesus through, like this first woman we looked at who lost her son, and you lost a daughter. Talk to us about that, if you would.
Well, like you said, I did lose my daughter. She was my number 3 out of 4 kids. We lost her January 7th of 2016. She was 9.5 years old, and we lost her to just a complication with a congenital heart defect and a pulmonary hemorrhage. And sorry, I drew a blank there.
It's all right.
You talk about, what is it like to follow Christ through something like that? I think I was faced with two decisions. I was faced with the decision to follow Christ, love Him, worship Him, be an example of Him after this tragedy, or I had the decision to turn my back on Him and allow my 3 remaining sons to see that. And I'm so thankful for the foundation of faith that I was raised on by my parents, that turning my back on Him wasn't really even an option. The option was, how do I continue to love Him and follow Him and trust Him after this, after Eloise's death? And like I said, I have a 15-year-old son, a 14-year-old son, and a 3-year-old son. And they still needed a mama, and they still needed a mother and a daddy who chose to follow Christ. And so we just chose to trust Him, believe in His word, believe in His promises. And our prayer was that one day that, our boys can see that they can grow to be men who know that they're going to face trials and know that they're going to face issues where they're faced with a choice whether to follow Him or turn their back on Him. And they can look back on the example that was set for them by me and by their dad, that God is still good, God is still kind, and He still loves us, and still asks us to choose to follow Him.
There was a lot of grieving, and so Christians grieved, and you and Clayton grieved in different ways. The boys grieved. What did you tell your boys about losing their sister, and why did God have that happen?
It's a hard question. It really is. I shared in the first service that this was not part of my timeline. My boys know that I am a very structured, list maker, task-oriented type of mom. And so my identity kind of came as the mom of our family, really with just taking care of Eloise, their sister, and taking care of her medical needs, taking care of, her academic needs. And so, after she was gone, it was like, who am I? Who am I now that I don't have her to take care of? And God said, don't be upset about what I took away. Look at what you still have. Look at the opportunities that you still have in front of you to pour into and to love. And so, as a family, we just chose to believe that this was God's time, because as some of you who have been part of the Orchard Church have kind of walked through Eloise's journey with us and have seen through, testimony, some of the miracles, the physical miracles that He performed on her body time and time again in hospitals, times we walked away from the hospital. And then here we are, and, she was not healed physically. We spent days fasting and praying in those 6 days that she was on life support, and that was not the answer He had. And so teaching my boys that His answers come in different methods. God allowed her death to happen so that He could be glorified so much more through an opportunity that He's provided for our family and for our community. He talked about community and having those fellow believers come alongside you and support you in these instances. And that happened. We live in Cabot, Arkansas, which is a bedroom community outside of Little Rock. And all of Eloise's care was at Arkansas Children's Hospital, which is one of our leading hospitals in pediatric cardiovascular issues. And God said, this is an opportunity for Eloise's death to glorify me and for it to be publicly glorified. And our community gathered together. There's some women in our community who gathered together and saw an opportunity through people who were grieving, people who were hurt, people who were really struggling with their faith, struggling with, why did God allow this to happen to a girl who had a life that was full, a girl who, loved others and loved Jesus, and a family that loves Jesus, and a family that's dynamic in the community. Why did God happen? Why did God allow this to happen? And this community rose together, and we formed a nonprofit from her death. She was called Wheezy. That was her nickname, and so it's called Walk for Wheezy. It's a nonprofit that allows us to give back financially to the cardiovascular intensive care unit, Arkansas Children's Hospital. It allows us an entrance to be able to go into that unit and proclaim the good news. And the good news of hope, and the good news that there's a greater physician than the surgeons and the medical teams, and allows us to provide financial needs for research to be done on congenital heart defects and just the different issues that, arise in those situations. So, you talk about how you process this sort of thing and how you teach your children to process this sort of thing, is that knowing that God is bigger and God is greater, and that his plans are ultimate.
It was cool that God gave you the opportunity to get into the lives of some of the surgeons who weren't necessarily really close to the Lord, just very keyed in on their scientific and medical work, and they saw your faith up close and personal. Some of the nurses, and were pretty deeply touched by that. That was really cool. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. I love you. Corey?
How do I follow that? I mean,
You're a professional woman. You have 2 children, Sadie and Frankie, and you work in a male-dominated industry. You're in banking. So as a Christian woman, how do you follow Jesus as a career woman in that kind of atmosphere? What have you learned about that? Yeah,
well, okay.
Go ahead. We'll just talk.
So I work in corporate America, I guess you can say. I'm a senior vice president at a local financial institution in town. So I'm surrounded by a lot of men, and I've learned a lot. But a couple years ago, I was brought into HR, and I was surprised. I thought I was getting promoted, but I wasn't. And I was told that people had reported that I was too bold. I asked too many questions, my expectations were too high, and I needed to work on that. Well, I'm sitting there thinking, well, all those things you said about me are true, and so I was ordered to take self-awareness training. I don't know if any of you have taken that before. So basically, I sat there and listened, asked to just process for a while. I had 2 options. I can get really mad and stomp my foot and throw a fit and say, wait a minute, if there was a man in here, you wouldn't be telling him to take self-awareness training because this is how they're supposed to act, and I could go down that road. Or I could take the lesser road and actually go Jesus on him. Do what Jesus would do. The old saying, JD? And so I embraced that opportunity, went through the training, learned a lot about myself. But my counterparts, who also had to be involved in some sort of fashion, they also learned about themselves as well. And we actually saw Jesus work through that and basically create a completely different, it shifted the culture of our financial institution. It was really neat to see God work through something like that, Something that seemed kind of small. I think sometimes we trivialize a lot of things, thinking that, how could Jesus work through that? But he can do such big things. And that it was just kind of an exciting time at my workplace. And it was just kind of neat to be a part of that, even if, I was when it started it all.
So you have, you're working, you have two children, and part of our church here, and you're discipling your children, but you spend lots of, it's like so many families in our church. Dad and mom are working, kids are there. How do you disciple your children? How are you helping your children learn about Jesus when they're just a lot of, life is really hectic?
Well, I love to work. I do. And I know that sometimes a lot of females feel guilty about not being able to spend the kind of time they want with their children, and they think that they're sliding them by putting them in daycare. And, I don't feel that way. I'm very proud of, the family that we've built, and I'm proud to have my children and giving them the opportunities to be in good places and learn a lot. And we talk a lot in the car. I called it last service my couch on wheels, because we're going to and from tutoring to soccer to school. And we use that opportunity to talk about real life experiences, to talk about Jesus, to talk about just life in general. The girls that are hateful at school, and I talk about how you might not be the best reader or the smartest person in class, but by goodness, Jesus loves you. And, it's just really neat to, I want my kids to see, I want to set an example for my children. I want them to see the way that I react to certain situations. Again, I shared in the first service. Yesterday, I was pulled over by the police officer, Memphis' finest. And the officer came up to the window, and I didn't know what I was doing. I just pulled into Starbucks. And he said, ma'am, I pulled you over because your tags are expired. And I was like, what? They are? Really? Are you sure? He's like, yes, I got a ticket. Well, again, taking that opportunity to show my daughter the way that we can react to this. So I thanked the officer for the reminder and, wished him well, thanked him for his service. So it's just little things like that I think that we can, show Jesus in that. I don't know if you remember, but you had a radio spot a few years back and you said, go out and make today matter. And that's kind of how I approach each day.
Great, thank you.
Welcome.
Love you.
Love you too.
Ruthie, you're the matriarch of the family. And you followed Jesus through a lot of physical limitations from early on in our marriage. Talk to us about that.
Okay. Well, I'm like any other woman. We quickly realize in womanhood that life is difficult from the various challenges that we all face each day. So I decided that each day I was going to ask, and I do ask, the Lord to help me identify anything in my life that would distract me from Him. And the biggest battle that I have, apart from just balancing time, is my physical limitations. And so I quickly had to come to realize that it was important to me to know that Jesus is enough. Is His calmness enough for me when I am just overcome by pain? Is His ability to give me contentment enough when I find myself a little bit jealous because some other woman is able to do much more than I'm able to do because of my physical limitations? Is His love enough for me when I find myself just unable to like and love my children at times because I'm distracted by how I'm feeling? And I quickly realized, as we sung earlier, that I am blessed. I have been called by God. I am anointed by Him. I am highly favored by Him. And so I've taken Psalm 16:5 daily, and I pray this verse every day to Him, which says, "You, Lord, are all that I have. You have given me all that I need. My future is in your hands." And when I stay focused on that verse, His word, throughout all of Scripture, I realize very quickly that no matter what I come about as a woman in my life, that Jesus is enough for me.
So what does this mean for men? It means that we treat women like Jesus did. We love women like sisters, that we never violate the trust of women, that we serve beside women, that if you are a guy who is sleeping with your girlfriend, that if you are cheating on your wife, if you are downloading porn, if you're hanging out at strip clubs, you are part of a culture of abuse and violence and rape and slavery and disease and oppression. You need to know that. If you belong to Jesus, you're to bring healing and life. You're not to bring suffering and death. That Jesus is the example of how we men are to honor and treat all women, especially women who are the most vulnerable. And ladies, it means you need Jesus. You were made to follow Jesus. You were made to worship Him passionately and boldly and to serve Him. It means you're gifted by Him. It means you're to follow Him. It means we as His church are to trust His word, what it says, and live for Him. Would you stand in prayer with me, please?